Hey there, Pastor Rob here. Welcome to my study. We are just about at the beginning of the season of Advent, and Advent is a time that is meant to lead us up to the Christmas season. And traditionally, it's a time where we focus on waiting and anticipation for the birth of Christ, and we look at what that has meant throughout history and what it means for us today. During the season of Advent here at Sunny Slope, we're going to be looking at the theme, the Christmas story according to Paul. And we're going to be looking at a number of passages in Paul's writings that give us some insight into who the Messiah is and what it is that he came to do. What I want to do this morning is I want to introduce you to the first text in our series, and that's from Romans chapter 1, verses 1 through 7. And we're going to look at what Paul says when he actually says that the Messiah or Jesus is descended from David. And what I want to do this morning, or what I want to do this in this video, is actually just take you into my study and walk you through the passage, and we're going to study it together. And I haven't done a whole lot of study on the text yet, and so you're actually going to be walking with me as I do really it's my second read through of the text. The first thing that I do is I read through the passage and I try to lay it out according to all of its different phrases. And that helps me see the flow of thought in a passage. And so once I've done that, then I like to go back through in some real careful detail and focus on the words and the language and how all the different ideas relate together and how they flow together. That's really one of the best ways that you can learn and identify what is the message of the text, because that's really what we're after. We don't want to hear, we're not so much interested in what does this text say to me? What is it, how do I read it? What's the message for me? Our first and most important question is, what did this text mean for the people who first heard it? What was the message for them? And from there, we can learn and discover, how does that message speak to us today? So let's go. I'm going to pull my screen up so you can see it. And as you can see, I've already put the passage in front of you, and you can see that I've broken it all down according to the different phrases. And we're going to just start at the beginning, and we're going to look at, we're just going to kind of break the text down little by little. So I'm going to put my pen here, and let's start with yellow. So Paul is introducing the letter. We already know that it's Romans 1, verses 1 through 7. And the first thing that stands out is that Paul is following the traditional Roman letter writing format. So he introduces himself here, but what is more important is not so much his name, but how does Paul see himself? And the first part of that, of course, is that he sees himself as a servant of Christ, but then he qualifies that with two separate phrases. Here's the first one. He's a servant that's called, and he's a servant that's set apart. So these phrases here, I happen to already know this. They are participles, which is in English, a participle is usually ending in ing. So it's, a person who uh, has been called. Now, doesn't translate that quite that way here, but these are participles, and they qualify, or they describe a servant. What is a servant? A servant is one who's called and who's set apart. Now, Paul further explains what that means. You can't just be called to something. You can't just be called. You have to be called to something. So he identifies himself as called to be an apostle, which is in Paul's time, and for Paul, he had to make a defense of that, because during the life of Jesus, an apostle was normally someone who was directly and personally connected to Jesus. But of course, Paul was not one of the original apostles, and so he had a unique experience on the road to Damascus. And so he has to remind people, or he has to maybe explain or defend that. There's no question that he was an apostle, but there was some in the time of the early church, there were some people that questioned his identity. So, but he's emphasizing here, he's called to be an apostle, and he's set apart. And again, not just set apart, but set apart for the gospel of God. Now, So this is Paul's this is how Paul this is his identity. This is kind of how Paul sees himself. But then he goes on and he's going to actually qualify and explain what is this whole gospel of God about. And this is where he actually says a couple of things. And this is, Paul is notorious for this. He'll frequently say something and then qualify it, and then he'll expand upon the qualification, and then he'll expand upon the expansion of the qualification. So Paul tends to have these very lengthy sentences, and it can sometimes be a little bit hard to follow his train of thought exactly. So the first thing we know, and you'll see that happening here, the first thing we know is that this is the gospel of God. Well, what gospel? Well, it's one which was promised beforehand. That's the first thing. In other words, the gospel is not new, and that's important in Paul's day because there were many people who looked at Christianity as something that was completely new and different. There was Judaism and then there was Christianity, and never the twain shall meet. That's how many people saw it. And Paul wants us to see that no, the gospel is not new, but it has been promised beforehand. Well, where has it been promised is your next question. Through the prophets, says Paul, through the prophets in the scriptures. So the gospel, if you look back in the Old Testament, you'll find already in the Old Testament, the message of the gospel is being the foundation for the gospel is being laid already back in the prophets in scriptures. Well, then the next question. So that's the gospel is promised beforehand. The gospel is also concerning his son. So we know two things about the gospel now. First of all, it's not a new idea. Second of all, it's the gospel has something to do with God's son. Um, Well, what do we know about God's Son? Well, there's a ton of things we could say, but Paul wants to emphasize this, who was descended from David, was declared to be a son of God by his resurrection. So a little later on, we'll get to this in a second, we're going to find out who is the Son, right? And this is the Sunday school answer. Well, it's Jesus. Okay, we know that, but for a moment, let's pretend we don't know any of that. Let's pretend we're listening to this for the first time. And now we know it's the gospel concerning his son. And then it's interesting to me. He says, well, he's descended from David. So this is, we might say we can draw a little picture here. This is royal lineage. And that's important because Jewish people, of course, were looking for a Messiah who was an anointed one as a king, but not only that, but the king couldn't just be any king. It had to be a king in the line of David. And so if you're a Jewish person in the first century, any any message about a king would be dead on arrival unless you could show that the king was connected to David. Any claim to messianic authority or messianic identity had to be connected to David. And so Paul, he's laying this out. He's going to say, okay, it's the gospel about the son who was descended from David according to the flesh. Now we're going to have to look a little more at that, but it seems that what Paul is actually getting at here is that Jesus is a king according to his earthly lineage. Now, what does that mean? I don't know yet. We're going to have to do a little more study on that. So we know one thing about the son, that's he's descended from David. God's son has an earthly lineage that connects him to David. That's one thing. The second thing we now are told is that he's declared to be the Son of God in power. So what does that mean? Well, again, we're not quite sure yet. We're going to have to do a little more digging, but it's something connected to the identity and maybe you might say the authority of the Son of God. So he's someone who has authority. Now, again, this is where exegesis, where these are places where now we know we've got to go a little deeper. We've got to unpack that a little more. But this is only our second reading through, and so we're not quite there yet, and that's okay. But you'll notice that Paul does something here in his language, and I'm just going to highlight this. He tells us something about his descent, the son's lineage of David according to the flesh. And then a little later on, I notice he says, according to the Spirit. So the identity of Jesus, we find his according to the flesh, he's connected to David. According to the Spirit, he's connected to the Son of God. And so you begin to see there's a contrast there, spirit and flesh. The Son of God, he's the Son of God. That's maybe his divine identity, descended from David, earthly lineage. Now, again, we're just looking at sort of initial ideas here. There's a lot of room to come back and sand down the rough edges, and maybe the things that we're thinking now, we go back a little later and we say, well, that turns out I was wrong about that, and that's okay. Um, how is how is the Son of God declared to be the Son of God, to be declared to be the Son of God in power? How is the Son? And by the way, we can kind of highlight some words here, just for emphasis. Oops, that's an eraser. We don't want that. We're gonna just highlight. I'm gonna highlight a couple words here. I'm gonna highlight Son right there, and I'm gonna highlight Son here. And I don't think I see it anywhere else, but maybe I missed one. But anyways, um, couple of ideas, a couple of words there that we want to highlight, and maybe while we're at it, we'll just highlight a couple more words. Jesus Christ stands out. Jesus Christ over here. Um, yeah, that's probably good enough for now. Um, okay, back to our thinking. My mind sometimes jumps around, and I'm sometimes kind of all over the place, but that's kind of how my study goes at times. So he's declared, how is he declared? Well, it's his resurrection from the dead that is his declaration of power, right? That makes sense. How does Jesus validate or verify his power? How can we know that he really is who he says he is? Well, it's his resurrection, right? If someone can show that he's more powerful or stronger than death, that's a pretty good sign that the person is, you know, has power. I found another instance of the word Christ. Whoops. So we're going to highlight that while I'm thinking of it. Right there, Christ Jesus, Jesus Christ. So again, that kind of tells us that we see that emphasizes the idea of we're talking about Jesus and who is he, and this is unpacking all of that. So that begins to you begin to see how that all emerges. Okay, so we now know we're talking about Jesus. We're talking about the gospel. We're talking about the identity of Jesus, the gospel about Jesus, the good news about Jesus. We know that it's promised beforehand. We know that we know that Jesus is God's son. We know that it's not a new idea. He's descended from promised in the prophets. We know that he's connected to David. We know that he's been declared to be God's son, and that has been demonstrated and displayed on the by way of the power that Jesus shows through his resurrection of the dead. Well, what does all of that mean for us? Well, that's where Paul goes in the next section. So, through Jesus Christ, through whom we have received, I should use a different color here just to keep that consistent. Through whom we have received, let's go to blue. We have received what? Well, grace and apostleship. Um, Now we have another word that we're going to just highlight just to draw some attention to. We're going to highlight it in blue. The idea of apostle. Now the question is, and this is a question, this is again one of these things that we're going to come back to. We're going to ask the question, well, who is the we? Um, we've all received grace, that's true, but why does Paul say we've received apostleship? And then the answer might be as simple as saying, well, Paul's writing, he's the one writing, and he's got some others probably with him. And so he's saying Jesus Christ is the one that through whom I have received apostleship, I and my companions. That would make a lot of sense, but we're not totally sure yet. So we're going to actually put a little question mark there. We're going to come back to that and see if we can't figure a little more about that. But you'll notice so we've received grace and apostleship. That's the idea of calling. But for what purpose? Well, here's where you have um, this is I always, the infinitive is always such a great thing to look out for because it tells you infinitive is anytime you have a word with the like a verb to run, to eat, to you know sell, whatever it is. That's the verb without any past, present, or future attached to it. And so we've received grace, but there's a purpose to bring about the obedience of faith. Now, the obedience of faith, that idea itself is packed full of content because Paul clearly wants to see us living a life of obedience. So Christianity is not devoid of action or work, but it's not just obedience, it's the obedience of faith. So it's the sort of way of life that comes about as you live out the faith and the trust that you have in Jesus. So the purpose of grace then is to bring about obedience of faith. So God graciously reconciles us to himself, right? There's the idea of called and set apart. That's all an act of God's grace. That's the idea of the gospel here. But the gospel produces then obedience of faith. And that too is for a purpose, for the sake of his name, including you who are called. So um, you can begin to see how Paul sees. I would suggest that this probably has the primary purpose here, the primary thing that Paul's talking about here is his own apostolic identity. And that I'm not certain on that yet, but that seems to make sense because Paul says, we've received this grace and apostleship to bring about the obedience of faith for the sake of his name among the nations. And then this is where he refers to the Romans, including you who are called. Now, again, we're gonna highlight something here. Oops. Here's the idea of called. And we know what he's already mentioned that idea. Oops, I actually overused the color green there. It should be consistent. Let's try this again. Let's pick a different color so that we can stay consistent. Let's go pink. Called to be an apostle, and then he goes on and says, we're also called. So so the idea here is that Paul is, you begin to see that the big picture, Paul is called, and his calling is to bring others to know their calling as well. And how does that happen? Well, that's what we got into already. It's the gospel of God becomes the means by which a person is called. And so the calling, Paul is a messenger of the calling, and the calling has to do with the gospel. It's not a new gospel. It's promised beforehand. The gospel is about his son. Son is connected to David. The son is declared to be one of power by way of his resurrection. And the son is the one through whom we receive the grace to bring about the obedience. And then he brings, and it's this final part, we tend to, I think, overlook this a little bit. I'll just stay with the pink since we're already there. To those in Rome, right? So here's, the from, and now we have the to. Those are the parts of a good email that you'd have today. Have it back then as well. To all those in Rome. And then, once again, hey, there's that word calling again. So let's switch it to a highlighter. And there it is again. So now we have this idea, Paul is called, the Romans are called, and they're called to be what? Well, he actually doesn't say here they're called to be apostles. Maybe that's worth noting. He says you're called to be saints. So that's, he's speaking God's message to the message of the gospel, the message of God's grace in Christ is being addressed to the saints in Rome, and the calling for them is to be saints. We're going to highlight a couple more things here now that as we go a little further along. We want to note Paul actually comes back again to the idea of Jesus Christ. There's that. The idea of calling we already got. But I also notice there's the word there's the word grace, right? Grace to you and peace. And then we find that up here as well. Um, that's also an idea that's repeated. So, again, we're still very early in our study, right? We're not very far along yet, but we've noted a couple things, and let's maybe just if we can write them down here. We've noted first of all that the idea of calling Paul, Paul's, and Rome's. Oops, spelling matters. We've noted the identity of Jesus, and we've noted a couple things about that. We've noted number one, he is the Son of God. We've noted that he's been promised beforehand. We've noted that he's in the kingly line. And then we've also noted um, the idea of let's just call it obedience. I'm not quite sure how to flesh that one out yet. But now again, let's just put this here. In no way does this complete our study. We're just sketching out some ideas here, and we're wanting to follow the logical thought of Paul, and we're trying to look at what's his message. What is he trying to get across to his people, to the church? And he's trying to communicate something about who Jesus is. And what does that have to do with us? And so we're a little further along now. We actually have some answers to that. We've got to put some, flesh on those bones, but we're off to a pretty good start. So the next thing we're going to do, and I'll stop the video here in a second, but the next step would be to start kind of reflecting on those things. You start looking at other places in the Bible that talk about some of these ideas. What do other parts of the Bible say? How does Scripture interpret Scripture? You're going to maybe dig into what do some of these words mean, or there's some, especially words that maybe we're not quite as familiar with, and you're going to do a word study. You're going to look at the meaning of those words, and then from there, you begin to sort of internalize and reflect on this. One of the big steps in Bible study is just to ask the question, so if this really is true, and if I really believe this, what difference would it make in my life? And then my work in terms of preparing and putting together a message, you have to organize those thoughts. You have to find a way to make them kind of fit together so that they can be easily understood by the people listening. So I hope you'll tune in. Our first Sunday in this series will be December 1st, and I hope to see you there. Thanks for joining me.